coming up, we have why the criminal justice system needs data. And so please welcome to the stage Amy Bach, Anna Zamora, and Justin Steele. And accompanying them is our moderator, TechCrunch's Haya Camps.
Okay, I am here with a really, really awesome panel, talking about a topic I'm super embarrassingly excited about, which is data. So I've actually spent a lot of time digging around in DOJ data, as you do in your spare time. And there's an overwhelming quantity of stuff actually out there. But I get a very specific feeling that what's out there is actually masking what's not out there. Amy, do you have any insights there?
Sure. There is, data out there, but what it's not available to do is to see two really key things. One is how counties operate on the local level. So there are 3,000 counties in America, and that's where justice happens. And right now, you can't look at a county and see how it's performing according to the data. And the other thing is there aren't any measures so that you can see, from the whole system, from arrest to post-conviction, how a system is operating. And by measures, I mean things as simple as a trial rate, right? Like, what's the percentage of cases that go to trial? People in jail for under $500 bail. You can't look across a whole state and see what's really happening here. And so if I asked you, for example, like where you live, like where are the good schools, you could definitely tell me. Even if you don't have kids, you would know, right? And if I said to you, where's the good hospital, you could probably even tell me by specialty, whether it's cancer or you're pregnant, where to go. But if I said to you, well, how does the criminal justice system operate here in San Francisco, and how does it differ from other counties in California versus Milwaukee, Raleigh, North Carolina, you would have no idea. And that's because we don't have measures, and we don't put these measures against data for everybody to see.
And I think that's a really interesting piece of that. I mean, you guys, sorry to just keep talking back and forth, you guys recently released a massive data set for 6 states?
Yes.
And what was the biggest challenge in getting that data?
Oh my gosh, there were so many challenges. Well, what we did was we started with one state. We started with the state of Wisconsin, and we realized that if you got the court data and then you supplemented it with district attorney, public defender, and sheriff's data, you could really create a picture, as I was saying, of the whole system from arrest to post-conviction. Then what we did was we added 5 more states. As we wanted to have 300 counties, which is 10% of the US, which is a statistically significant number. So we went county to county, and we basically said to prosecutors, hi, we're with Measures for Justice. You don't know who we are yet, but here's a PowerPoint. We're going to walk you through what we're doing. Would you give us your data? And often the biggest challenge was first convincing them that this is something important to do. And usually, they often said, we get it, let's do it. But getting the actual data, we had to often go to a vendor, or we had to figure out how to get it out of their system. And then it was up to us to clean and code it and normalize it and put it in a form so that we could start analyzing it.
And so far, California hasn't been one of those states. But I hear you may have raised some money from Google.org to expand to California and actually take on the whole state?
Yes, we are going to be measuring the entire state of California. We are venturing here, and it is a different state because it's bigger, and you've got a lot of challenges in terms of data. But we're here in part because there's so much interest here. Like, people really want this. from in all corners of the state, all different levels, from advocates to justices to prosecutors. There's really a feeling here of like the time is now, maybe because of realignment or just because, of what's been going on in this country and California just being super forward thinking. But we feel like this state is really primed for measures for justice, and we're extremely excited that Google has joined us in this.
So what is Google's horse in the race? Why are you excited about this?
Well, if you think about Google's mission, it's to organize the world's information and make it universally accessible and useful. So we've got that mission. We're obviously a data company, and we're data geeks, and we get excited about this work just kind of inherently based on our work. But the real seed for this work was last summer when Philando Castile and Alton Sterling were shot and killed, and our Black Googler network started to organize moments of solidarity across the company. And one of the things that the Black Googlers, we all kind of huddled up, and my engineers all came together, and they said, okay, just give us the data set. Like, give us the policing data. Just, give it to us, and we'll crunch it, and we'll put out the information.
And you're like, yeah, let me grab that for you.
And I was like, pause, guys. There actually is no national data set. There's 18,000 law enforcement agencies across the country. None of them centrally report their data into one place. There is no data set to analyze. And that was like a big aha, I think, for our engineers. Like, how is that even possible? And so we've invested $20 million to date in criminal justice reform under our racial justice initiative at Google.org. I work at Google.org. We do the philanthropy for the company. And so these investments in Measure for Justice, Center for Policing Equity, is really almost an opportunity to bring this data set together and get our engineers an opportunity to actually, along with the folks in the field, really be able to analyze something and figure out where does that racial bias exist and what are some policies and practices we can put in place to reduce it.
That's awesome. So ACLU's stated goal is to reduce the incarceration rate by 50%. But a net decrease seems like it's only a part of the challenge. What other data points is it we should be looking at?
So just so everybody knows, I am not a data geek. I love data, but I'm an advocate. So as you just said, at the ACLU, we have a very straightforward goal in our criminal justice work, and it is to end mass incarceration by reducing the prison population by 50% and greatly reducing and/or ending racial disparities in the system. And I don't think you can have one without the other. We have to be focusing on ending or at least greatly reducing racial disparities throughout the system while we work to end mass incarceration. And data is incredibly important in making sure we are meeting those important markers. Because at the end of the day, when we get to the day when we have ended mass incarceration and reduce the jail and prison populations in this country by 50%, if we have increased racial disparities, can we say we have accomplished our goals? And I say no, absolutely not. So data is incredibly important in all of our work, but I think it's mostly important in evaluating our progress, because we're at a moment in time where we are actually making progress, particularly here in California. Our voters across the state are ready and hungry for reform, and they're voting on really complicated criminal justice reform measures that are working to actually reduce our jail and prison populations. But we need to make sure that we're doing it and being mindful of racial disparities and racial inequity. So that's where data is so very, very important from all levels, from police to prosecutors, to sheriffs, to our correction system, to probation and parole, et cetera. So I'm incredibly excited for Amy to come into California.
But I love what you said about naming all the different players, because so often people will bad apple one part of the system, and they'll say prosecutors are the most powerful, and we just have to focus on prosecutors. But a prosecutor doesn't get to do what he does without having a relationship with the public defender who, might even, accede to certain things that he or she shouldn't because, they don't have the right funding or the right position or the right culture. And the same thing with judges. No judge acts alone. Everybody works together. And so that's what's beautiful about the way the measures were created. there's no shaming here. There's no name and blame. There's no single person it's all about seeing a data point so that you can bring the people around the table and begin to have a conversation. It's all about starting a conversation. And the idea is no data, no change. That's the motto. So if you begin to see the data, you can begin to change it. You can't see what you can't change.
Yeah.
You can't change what you can't see.
One more thing on that, too.
Yeah.
I think it's going to be very impactful in terms of changing the culture of criminal justice in California and throughout the country, because right now we do have these silos. We have like the prosecutor silo, the probation silo, the public defender silo, the court silo. And I think with data, we can work to see the system more holistically. Because the truth of the matter is, these are people's lives. And one person is moving through all of these different disparate systems. And we can't track that person very well because of this lack of data. And so something like Measures for Justice will allow us to see the whole system and see how it impacts a life, which is at the end of the day what we're working to improve, people's lives,
right, and,
getting people home.
And if you think about that, say what you just said, and I said, these are people's lives. These are people's lives, and sometimes people say, oh, the data's not good enough to do this. And we go to extreme measures to make sure that everything that we release is buttoned up and as valid as possible. But we can only do so much. And if you're going to be making risk assessments based on this data, then you've got to improve your data for our use and for those uses, and because this is how sentencing decisions are made, are based on this data. So it's not just for our analytics, it's for yours. Yep. So the whole thing improves. Data breeds data. Put it out there. Let the public see that a county, they haven't had a trial in 5 years. There are counties, if you look on measuresforjustice.org, you can start perusing, you can look in and find, there's all sorts of things in there. And if you start looking at them, people will say, well, maybe the data was wrong. Well, then fix the data. Data breeds data. Yep.
I think that's super exciting. And I think the other interesting thing is, up to a point in the criminal justice system, everything that happens is invisible. A police officer walks up to somebody, asks them a question, decides whether or not to arrest, then they do arrest them, they take them to prison, and they may or may not be charged with something. From the charging decision onwards, we have the possibility, at least, of having data. Up to that point, it gets very fuzzy. We do have, today, there was a load of data was released about analyzing body cam footage, like how language is used, and it was absolutely fascinating to see how language is used very, very differently based on somebody's background, which sounds interesting. How do you actually get at that type of data as well if the data doesn't exist, then it might be difficult to actually get at?
Well, one thing is, I was actually talking to somebody about this last night. So there's the data you have, right? And that can begin to show interesting things. And then there's the data you don't have. And by showing what you've got, it puts in stark relief. Well, yes, you've got that measure, but that doesn't really get at the point of what we want. We want this other thing. And that's exactly what happened in other fields. So 30 years ago, hospitals, people started to do healthcare measurement. And they came up with a measure, mortality rate, right? So, so outcomes, here's the worst hospital in America had the most deaths. Oh, well, that hospital turned out to be a hospice, okay? Because everyone dies there in a hospice. So of course they had a high mortality rate. And people said, that's the wrong measure. Instead, you need these other measures. So the idea is, this is just day one of flying this airplane. There will be a day 2 and a day 3 and a 4.0, but let's just get this one out there so that a conversation can begin about what actually should we be collecting so that more and more will be possible. And then, as Anna said, so that we can begin to track and make sure that we're getting towards the goals that we want to.
Yeah. I mean, the hospital example is really good, right? Because you can dodge your taxes, you can't dodge death, that kind of thing. And so you find a lot of people are shifting patients from hospitals to hospices. So the hospital actually looks better in rankings. Well, that's a very good example of incentivization versus data, right? If you incentivize for low death rates, you get everybody shifting people out of hospitals. But there is something that needs to happen in the criminal justice system as well around incentivization. And I think I was talking to you about this, Justin, about how you actually use the behavioral science, to take the data you have and make some sort of meaningful change. Do you have any examples of how people can actually take a giant batch of data and improve something in the real world?
So there's like a couple of different ways that you can look at how the bias kind of propagates itself through a system. There's obviously the individualized pieces where we know that people have implicit bias and they may act individually to perpetuate the bias. But there's also these situational factors that are really fascinating. So the Center for Policing Equity, one of our grantees, found in the Las Vegas Police Department, for instance, they analyzed all of the use of force data and they found pretty wide disparities by race on police use of force. But what they actually found was the situations that were propagating that use of force most directly were foot chases. And what was happening were, unlike the movies, I know we're used to seeing TV shows and movies where the police officer chases down the bad guy and they tussle and they fall to the ground. That's not actually how police foot chases usually end. It's actually a pretty less dramatic instance where a police officer pursues somebody. Oftentimes they don't actually end up catching them, but if they do, they can hold that person as long as they're not a threat to the officer or anybody else, and they can have a second officer get onto the scene, and while that adrenaline is rushing through that officer's body who actually instigated the chase, that person's actually not allowed by policy anymore to touch the potential offender. And so by doing that, they actually dropped use of force by over 30%. I mean, it was a simple policy change, a situational factor that they were able to see through the data, and even through that, reduce disparities. So I think there's a lot of, because the data hasn't existed, there's all this low-hanging fruit where if we had the data, there's these ahas that could really significantly reduce the bias that I think are exciting to sort of mine and find those.
But that also takes a system that is willing to take a piece of data and a theory and then go and test that and then implement that and that kind of thing. I think that's really fascinating. Is the hope that with this new data set we're building that those are the kind of things we start getting at?
Yes. You know, we've already seen the excitement that people have in a prosecutor looking at his data and saying, his or her data, and seeing how the other counties around him or her are doing. And, you know, there's this one prosecutor in Wisconsin, and he looked at his data and realized that 40% of the people that were in jail for not being unable to pay bail were there on under $500 bail, 40%. I mean, and he realized that part of the problem was that people were coming in on the weekends, and they don't staff with a prosecutor then, so a judge wasn't releasing them. So he just said, all right, you can release, we waive the right for a prosecutor, their judge, you can do, and he's hoping to see improvements there. And he's realized that if he gets that number down, he saves $60,000. The county saves $60,000. And that's the whole point, is that like you do the right thing, it also saves money, it's more fair, it's more fiscally responsible. So, and once you start doing that and saving money, you begin talking about it, and someone sees you as a bright spot, and another county starts doing it. And we can create a network of people all creating best practices and trying to improve things.
Sometimes we assume that everybody's hiding from this data, but I think we're actually be pretty surprised at how many of the leaders of these systems actually do want to do the right thing and actually want to change their systems.
Totally.
Center for Policing Equity, and I know Measure for Justice, they're working collaboratively with law enforcement agencies, with court systems who are voluntarily collaborating to give the data. Now, we certainly need the ACLUs of the world or the DREs of the world to put pressure on when those folks aren't forthcoming and cooperative and the systems are showing that there's a lot of bias. But I think there's actually a lot of leaders in the system who actually want to do the right thing. They want to see the data. They want to do better. And so there's a huge opportunity.
And the voters want it too. I mean, you know, it's about connecting. I mean, I think through data and narrative and social media and technology, we can really bring these issues into the homes of voters. So voters can really start to understand, you know, both the issues and the people in charge. You know, in California, the district attorney is an elected official. Every county in California has a district attorney that is elected by the voters. And yet, because there's so much holes in the data of prosecutors' offices, and they're allowed to make these important decisions that impact people's lives without any accountability, increased data and increased narrative can really create an arc where voters understand that they have the power to hold these powerful elected officials accountable. And I think it's all part of the solution to how we we solve this incredibly enormous problem of criminal justice reform that is very, very complicated. It's one important tool in a myriad of tools.
Right, I love that you said that it could make voters more informed. But the thing is that if a voter hears from a prosecutor, look, I had a racial disparity in this measure. I didn't know I had this. I didn't realize that I was treating whites and non-whites differently. Here's what I'm doing to address it. That prosecutor looks great.
Yeah. Well, it's powerful, very powerful.
Yeah, and just on that point, I was watching the documentary I Am Not Your Negro this weekend, and there's this beautiful James Baldwin quote towards the end of the film where he talks about, not everything that's been faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it's faced. In a lot of cases, people don't actually understand what they're facing, the leaders of these systems, and so we have to tell the data. We've got to get the stories. We've got to get the narratives. We've got to get the historical information. That's a whole other piece, because there's a whole piece of historical fact base that our country doesn't understand either. But all of those things need to come together for us to face this stuff.
Yeah, that's exactly it. And it's like foundational to everything. Like, we're here at this conference and we're hearing all about these amazing ideas and amazing programs. But unless you can see where the interventions need to happen and how the change is happening across these states, and we have 3,000 counties, 76 counties, in one state, 84 in another, 200 in Texas, some odd. Unless you begin to see what's happening in small towns and rural places and corners of big cities, that's when you can really begin to understand how we're doing.
So grassroots data for national change. Sounds good to me. And on that note, we're out of time. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you.
And thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.